G'day guys, it's Kane from Kane's Trains here. In today's video, we'll be going for a ride on the Bendigo Tramways and having a look at the history of this fantastic tram network in a regional town that's beaten the odds and continues to run to this day. I hope you enjoy. In the beginning, there were the rolling hills and valleys of central Victoria. Prior to colonial settlement in the 19th century, this area had been the traditional home of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, who had lived off of the land for millennia. From 1837, colonial settlers were establishing sheep runs through the district, with multiple properties established over the next few years. This would include, amongst others, the Ravenswood Run. The days of livestock and agriculture being the primary industries in the area were however short-lived. In 1851, a small glisten of light was found in the Bendigo Creek, which ran through the Ravenswood Run. Gold had been discovered, and things would never be the same again. Within only a matter of months, thousands of new settlers had flooded into the region, hoping to make their fortunes. This influx of people would include a number of Chinese settlers, who would go on to make a significant part of the population. While gold was being extracted out of the ground in huge quantities, the collection of tents and shacks that surrounded the diggings was soon to give way to a permanent settlement. By the end of the 1850s, the new settlement was christened with the name of Sandhurst. By 1871, growth had been so rapid that the town had grown into a city. This growth had been accelerated following the arrival of a railway in 1862, linking Sandhurst directly to the capital city of Melbourne to the south and the river port of Echuca to the north. Following a public vote in 1891, the original name of Bendigo was reinstated. The wealth generated from gold was nothing short of immense, and the city of Bendigo would soon possess a bustling business district, with wide streets lined with grand public buildings. Underground, the city was crisscrossed with mine shafts, which quickly brought gold to the surface all across the city. However, it soon became apparent that gold was being dug out of the ground quicker than people could get around the city. The constantly growing population was placing pressure on the local transport network, which apart from train services out of Bendigo, consisted mainly of private horse cab services. These were, however, hardly an affordable means of travel for the miners who needed to either commute to work or for leisure around the city. A form of public mass transport was needed. By the 1880s, consideration was being given to the establishment of a tramway system as a means of solving the city's transportation woes. In 1887, a tramway conference was held to investigate the practicalities of establishing a tram service between the centre of Bendigo and the growing suburb of Eaglehawk, several kilometres away. After much consideration, it was decided that the proposed route from the Bendigo Railway to the Eaglehawk Town Hall would be worked by battery trams. Following the construction of the line and the delivery of 8 trams, public services would commence in June 1890. The battery trams were, however, a catastrophic failure. The steep gradients which abounded on the line would prove too much for the technology of the time. All too often, the batteries would simply run flat, and horses would have to drag the disabled tram back to the depot. After only 13 weeks, the new tramway system was closed. The first attempt at tramways in Bendigo had been an abject failure. For a year and a half, the cab drivers who had seen of the threat of the battery trams once again reigned supreme on the streets of Bendigo. Their resurgence would, however, be short-lived. The trams were to make a comeback, and this time they were going to stay. The liquidated assets of the former tramway were acquired, and work soon commenced on converting the tramway to steam operation. 5 trams were imported from the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia in the United States to provide the motive power, while the bodies of the dormant battery trams were converted into trailers towed behind the steam trams. The reinstated tramway, offering reliable services, immediately became a success. Despite complaints about soot and sparks, additional steam trams and trailers were ordered to operate the service. Despite the economic depression of the 1890s, the steam trams would continue puffing up and down the hills of Bendigo and Eaglehawk, providing an essential service to the growing city. Essential as it may have been, however, the economic effects of the time hit the operator hard, and by the end of the decade, a lifeline was needed. By 1899, that lifeline would come and it would spark new life to the tramways of Bendigo. In 1899, the British Insulated Wire Company, represented locally by the Electric Supply Company of Victoria, would burst onto the scene and became the new owners of the Bendigo Tramway. The new firm had major plans for Bendigo, with a major expansion of the tramway to serve more parts of the city, but more importantly, the system would be electrified. The original line from the middle of Bendigo to Eaglehawk would be rebuilt, while new lines would reach out to the suburbs of Golden Square, Quarry Hill, and Lake Waroona. The original tram depot facilities were considered inadequate, and a new, much larger tram depot, workshop, and self-contained power station would be built near the new Lake Waroona line. By April 1903, the electric tramway system had been established and was open to the public. The rejuvenated system was immediately taken into the hearts of the Bendigo population and became a part of daily life. The clean, efficient services offered by the electric trams would finally meet the needs of Bendigo after years of trial and error. The blaze of glory that surrounded the Bendigo electric tramways would, however, be relatively short-lived. The steadily declining fortunes of the gold mines during the early years of the 20th century, the struggles of the First World War, and the steady growth of motorbus traffic in the 1920s all conspired to place the Bendigo tramways under ever-increasing strain. The once gleaming fleet of trams started to look tired and decrepit, while the track and overhead wiring was worn out. Without a dramatic intervention, the Bendigo tramways would have quite literally fallen apart and faded away into oblivion. Fortunately, help was at hand. The Victorian state government would ultimately be the saviour of the Bendigo tramway network, albeit in a rather roundabout way. In 1919, an Act of Parliament established the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, or SEC, whose aim was to unify the electricity networks that had been established around the state. This would include the assets of the Electricity Supply Company of Victoria and, by extension, the Bendigo Tramways. Because the company had been granted a 30-year franchise from 1903 onwards, it wasn't until 1934 that the State Electricity Commission would finally take ownership of the local electricity network and the tramway. In addition to the Bendigo network, the SEC would also take ownership of two other regional tramway systems. These were the closely related Ballarat Tramway Network, which was also under the ownership of the Electricity Supply Company, and the Geelong Tramway Network, which had been established by the Melbourne Electric Supply Company. As its name would imply, the State Electricity Commission had not been intended to become a transport operator, and quite frankly, was not thrilled at the prospect of inheriting three local tramways. Sufficient pressure from the cities of Bendigo, Ballarat and Geelong would, however, ensure the retention of the trams, with an Act of Parliament essentially sealing the deal, authorising the SEC to become the tramway operator. After decades of private ownership, the public transport of Bendigo was now owned by the public. Out of the three inherited tramway systems, only the Geelong system was in a serviceable condition. The Bendigo tramway network was worn out, while the Ballarat network was on the verge of collapse, both metaphorically and literally. The condition of the two networks, with trams and infrastructure over 30 years old and given only minimal maintenance, meant that something had to be done. As the SEC had been forced to be a transport operator, various options for upgrading the systems were explored. These included replacing the trams with either motor buses or trolley buses, or retaining and improving the tram systems. After examining the various options, it was ultimately decided in 1934 that retaining the trams was the most cost-effective option. With the decision made to continue tramway operation, plans were prepared to refurbish the Bendigo system. The plans prepared forecast only 15 years of continued operation and would cost £68,000 to implement. Although it was assumed that adequate maintenance of the track would allow for a longer lifespan, as ever, money was tight, especially during the early years of the Great Depression. The SEC wasn't in any position to pay for the upgrade work out of its own resources. Substantial grants from both the state government and the National Recovery Fund were allocated and the upgrading of the Bendigo Tram network commenced, partially as a means of reducing unemployment during the Depression years. While track and infrastructure upgrades were being carried out, a new fleet of trams were required to replace the decrepit fleet, most of which dated from 1903. Buying new trams was out of the question, so the only option was to buy second-hand. Around this time, the Melbourne network had been going through a prolonged period of expansion and modernisation. As a result, a number of older and smaller trams were available for purchase by the SEC. Although second-hand, these trams were suitable for operation in Bendigo after some minor modifications, including conversion to driver-only operation. By 1936, 14 replacement trams had been acquired from Melbourne and placed into service in Bendigo. These had replaced almost all of the original fleet, but several of the 1903 built trams would receive an unlikely reprieve. The dark clouds of war were forming, and soon enough, Australia would be plunged into the Second World War. Even for a small city like Bendigo, signs of the conflict would soon make their impact felt in the community. The tramway would not be immune from the conflict either. With the declaration of war, Australia was mobilised to play its part in the conflict. Almost every aspect of the nation was directed to support the war effort, including the transport systems. In several cities, the existing tramway networks were extended to serve the newly established military ordnance factories, providing a cheap and reliable form of public transport during the conflict. Bendigo was no exception. With a new weapons manufacturing facility being commissioned at North Bendigo, this was only a short distance away from the existing Lake Waroona line. In 1942, a new extension was opened, running through suburban streets from near Lake Waroona to the ordnance factory. This new line, known as the North Bendigo route, would be the first and only expansion of the Bendigo Electric Tramway network since its initial 1903 opening. To provide enough rolling stock for the North Bendigo extension, several of the original 1903 trams were retained for a few more years by the SEC. This was only ever intended as a short-term fix though, as the lightly built cars were already over 40 years old and life expired. Replacement trams were needed urgently, and in 1947, the first of the new to Bendigo trams would arrive. On the Geelong tramway system, the SEC had amassed a fleet of 6 Burnie safety cars. 2 of these had been bought new for use in Geelong, while the remaining 4 were second-hand from Adelaide. With an influx of larger second-hand trams from Melbourne arriving in Geelong after the Second World War, these 6 Burnie trams were transferred to Bendigo to replace the last of the 1903 built trams. Although either second or even third hand, the Burnie trams were perfect for the Bendigo tram system. Being fully enclosed, capable of driver-only operation, and equipped with deadman safety equipment which would cut off the power and apply the brakes, these trams were major advancements on what had served before. The Burnie trams would become a unique and defining feature of the Bendigo system, instantly recognisable to locals and visitors alike. Although the arrival of the Burnie trams in Bendigo, along with several larger bogie trams from Melbourne in the immediate post-war period, provided a boost to the tram network, an all too familiar series of circumstances would conspire against the tramway. The arrival of additional trams in Bendigo would coincide with a dramatic increase in private car ownership after the war. As a result, collisions between road vehicles and the trams, especially at night, started to increase at an alarming rate. To combat this problem, the SEC would install additional lighting and paint warning chevrons on the exteriors of the tram fleet. These changes would make the regional tram fleet quite distinctive compared to trams running in any of the capital cities. The problems caused by increasing motor traffic would extend far beyond cars crashing into trams. Mounting financial losses, partially caused by declining ridership, were becoming a significant burden for the State Electricity Commission. These concerns were being raised as early as 1948, while in 1962, the Bendigo tram system alone had accumulated a deficit of £1 million. The SEC appealed to the state government to be allowed to discontinue tram services in Bendigo. In addition to mounting financial losses, another round of track and infrastructure renewals would soon be necessary. The cost incurred from both the operating deficit and the cost of future upgrades would have meant increasing power prices to Bendigo consumers and deferring other major projects on other portions of the power grid. As had occurred decades prior, the local council vehemently opposed the proposed closure of the tramway, and after formal protest, the trams would continue to operate after 1962. Undeterred, the SEC would seek permission to close the service again in 1965, and again in 1968. On each occasion, diesel buses were put forward as a potential replacement for the trams. On each attempt, the SEC was barred from closing the network by the Victorian state government. The trams would continue to operate despite the spectre of closure hanging over the tramway. By this time, most of the trams in service dated from the First World War period, and the public transport service they provided resembled a rolling museum. The unique atmosphere of this little regional tramway, with friendly staff willing to perform local errands for the community, and the unique experience offered by the ancient fleet of trams, would draw people to Bendigo from far and wide. This unique situation, sadly, would not last. In 1970, the State Electricity Commission would appeal to the state government to close the Bendigo Tramway once again. It was a case of fourth time's the charm, as permission was finally granted to close the tramway network and replace it with a local bus service. The clock was now running out of time, and with the passing of every day, the sound of the ticking got ever louder. All that remained now was to establish the local bus service around Bendigo. Putting the replacement bus service in place took some time, and it wasn't until 1972 that the trams would reach their final terminus. The Golden Square to North Bendigo service would close on the 5th of March 1972, while the main Eaglehawk to Quarry Hill service would be the last to close on Sunday the 16th of April that year. Such was the affection held by the people of Bendigo that when the last trams ran that day, people crammed on board in numbers not seen in years. Every available space was taken, with joyriders taking one final journey on the Bendigo Tramways. When the last trams made their runs through the city and to the depot, an estimated 20,000 people lined the streets to say a final goodbye. When the last tram arrived at the depot, time for the Bendigo Tramway had finally run out, at least as a public transport service. As the sun was setting on the State Electricity Commission era of operation, a new dawn for the tramway was on the horizon. In 1970, a group of locals who were concerned about the loss of Bendigo's heritage formed the Bendigo Trust. The aim of this organisation was to preserve and protect historic artefacts of Bendigo from destruction. In that year, the Central Deborah Gold Mine, closed in 1954, had been purchased by the Bendigo Council to save the last traditional gold mine in the city. The Bendigo Trust would work hand in hand with the council to bring the mine back to life as a heritage attraction. With the tramway running outside the front gate of the mine, and with closure a major topic of conversation at the time, moves were quickly made by the Trust to preserve part of the Bendigo Tramway. Following careful analysis, the section of track from the gold mine right through to the North Bendigo terminus was selected for retention. The last surviving Chinese Joss house in Bendigo, a major link with the historic Chinese presence on the goldfields, was located adjacent to the North Bendigo terminus. In addition, multiple places of historic interest surrounded the line proposed for retention. In July 1971, the Bendigo Trust submitted a formal proposal to the Bendigo Council for preservation of the tramway. The council would be a willing supporter of the scheme and work to preserve the tramway moved abreast. Local support was running high, with a petition of over 5,000 signatures being signed. The Bendigo Trust would approach the Victorian state government in February 1972, presenting their proposal and demonstrating the intense local interest being shown in their plans. Following several months of deliberations, approval was granted in September 1972 by the government for the retention of the trams, track, and other infrastructure to allow heritage services to operate. A formal trial period to conclude by Easter 1974 was announced, with a review of the operation to be undertaken afterwards. With the go-ahead given and some funds allocated to restore 4 trams for the new tourist service, work would take place at a frenetic pace. To prevent the removal of the trams from Bendigo, a formal moratorium was put into effect for the duration of the trial period. While the work to restore trams to the streets of Bendigo was going on, there was a knocking at the depot gates. Several members of the Tramway Museum at St Kilda in Adelaide had arrived, armed with a letter from the state government promising them a tram. More specifically, one of the prized Burnie trams. This immediately caused an uproar within Bendigo, and a major battle commenced. Members of the Bendigo Trust would remove the jacks that had been set up to load the tram onto a truck. Following this, the tram was pushed by hand back into the shed, and to prevent any possible attempt at moving it, lengths of steel bar were welded across the tracks. Members of the community were rallied and formed a blockade across the front of the depot. The Burnie tram was to remain in Bendigo, and the representatives of the Adelaide Tramway Museum returned without a tram. The impasse still remained, however, and would only be resolved several years later, when the body of a previously disposed of Burnie car was restored to running condition for the use in Adelaide. Despite the attempted collection of the tram being dubbed a hijack in the press, the publicity generated would be beneficial for both organisations in the long run. With the Battle of the Burnie won, the Bendigo Trust could once again focus on preparing for the opening of their heritage tram service. The big day finally came on the 9th of December 1972. Only 8 months after it was thought that the trams had disappeared from Bendigo, they had returned. The Premier of Victoria, Rupert Hamer, would break a bottle of Bendigo wine on the front of Burnie Tram 30 to officially open the new heritage tramway. For the new heritage service, each tram had been fitted with a cassette tape audio commentary system. This was used to describe places of interest and historical information to the passengers as the trams travelled through Bendigo. As a result, the trams have been popularly known as the Talking Trams ever since. Such was the popularity of the service that the initial trial period, initially set to end in Easter 1974, has now seen the Talking Trams in operation for over 50 years. Since 1890, the trams have been a beloved part of Bendigo, and with the Talking Trams of the Bendigo Trust, they will continue to be a part of the city of Bendigo for a long time yet. Today, the Bendigo Tramways and associated museum have become an iconic part of this regional town in Victoria. Favoured by locals and tourists alike, it has become a pleasant way to get through town and a way to learn of Bendigo's heritage through the famous Talking Trams. The tramways also have special events, such as the Groove Tram, and offer private charters of their beautifully restored and maintained heritage trams. In recent years, the tramways were a recipient of a generous grant that allowed them to upgrade their workshop and museum, as well as provide additional tram storage in a brand new, purpose-built shed behind their main depot. This has greatly expanded the size of their collection, and in future years will no doubt prove useful and beneficial. Part of these upgrades saw a tram converted to a cafe outside the museum and workshop site. I am yet to try the coffee, but I very much look forward to returning and trying the coffee for myself. 1 large dirty chai on oat milk, please. In summarising this video, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the history of the Bendigo Tramways and the visuals that have accompanied it. For more information on the Bendigo Tramways, I'll have a link to their Facebook and website in the description below. Please consider liking and subscribing today for more videos like this in the future. And if you made it to the end of this video, don't forget to comment pomelo. That's Pomelo. This fruit-bearing tree may seem indigenous to Bendigo, but it's actually a link to the town's Chinese heritage and history. I've been Kane from Kane's Trains. Thank you very much for watching.